What is a prenuptial agreement or a premarital agreement? Now, in Nevada, it is an agreement that two parties enter into before they get married that defines out, it can define out how they manage money and manage things during the marriage, and it can also define out what each party is entitled to in a divorce or if one of the parties passes away during the marriage. Now, in Nevada, a premarital agreement is presumed valid. And so if you have done everything good enough for a premarital agreement, the starting point for the judges here is that it's a valid agreement that they should uphold. Now, there are situations where a premarital agreement can be found to be invalid. One situation you want to be really mindful of is if one of the parties doesn't speak English fluently enough in order to actually understand what they're reading and what they're agreeing to. If there's a party to a premarital agreement who is not a fluent or native English speaker, it's wise to get that agreement translated into their native language so you can make sure that they understand. It's also wise to have attorneys for both parties to the agreement. It's not required, but it's certainly something the court will look at if someone's asking for it to be invalid, saying they didn't understand what they were doing. When one of the parties is an attorney, this is especially important to make sure that the other spouse actually has an attorney in reviewing and negotiating this premarital agreement. Another factor they look at is the timing before the marriage. So if parties have planned a marriage a year in advance and one day before the marriage, one of the parties drops the agreement on the other party and says, sign here, or we're sending home all 500 guests that came here for the wedding tomorrow, that's something that could be looked at by the court in determining that that premarital agreement is not valid. Whereas if you have one that's been negotiated back and forth over a long period of time, that definitely leads to the validity of it. And the timing and planning of the wedding itself can play a factor in. So if parties just decided to get married not too long before, then the amount of time for them to negotiate and finalize a prenup is much shorter than people who've been planning a huge wedding for a long time. And so these factors are things that the court will look at if one of the parties comes to court and says, I want you to determine that this premarital agreement is not valid. Now, the starting point for how the court divides property, sets alimony, and makes those kinds of orders in a divorce, those things are controlled by our law in Nevada. And so your premarital agreement is an opportunity for you to opt out of the default laws. A lot of people have in their head this impression that a premarital agreement is something that's going to be really awful, and it's just because one spouse is trying to take advantage of the other one before they get married. And that's not necessarily the case. A premarital agreement is an opportunity for two people to sit down and decide, what are we going to do? How are we going to manage our money while we're married? What are your expectations of what you're entitled to if we get divorced? And actually talk about those things and map them out. So in a lot of situations, a premarital agreement can be a really wonderful tool to make sure that both people are on the same page before they get married.